Thank you so much for joining me. This is Dr. Mark Burton. He's a developmental pediatrician. And Mark, rather than me, sharing your background, I would love for you to just share with everyone kind of how you got into developmental pediatrics and specifically helping kids thrive and mindful parenting for ADHD.
That's a whole lot of threads. So, there are two things that happen. Yeah, it kind of happened in parallel. The working with children, particularly with developmental differences, really has just been important to me, really going back to childhood for a lot of different reasons. So it's sort of a field I've always been in. My whole family's in special education. And then it was a sort of profound part of my childhood that we had some big family things happen. And one of the neighbors ran the local Special Olympics, and I started volunteering there. And that was a very, uniquely special experience for me. And so, from there, I actually didn't know initially I was definitely going into medicine. It was more that I wanted to work with kids. And then, pediatrics happened, and I always had this interest. Bringing mindfulness into it was kind of a parallel path. I actually was very grateful that I was introduced to mindfulness, sort of separate from medicine initially. When I was similar, you started coming out of that same period of time in my 20s. And then for me, medical school was really, really stressful. And, I don't want to suggest it's unique. Everyone goes through big stressful times, and that was one for me. And I got introduced to mindfulness practice at that point, and I started practicing my own. And then really what happened, I don't know if I believe in light bulb moments being that frequent in life, but I went to a conference that was a part of the Mind Life Institute looking at the research, the early research, this is a long time ago now, in like mindfulness and neuroplasticity and stress management. And the Dalai Lama was there and all these famous scientists. And it was really over the course of about a weekend that I had this like moment saying of like, I'm working with all these families where, everyone is just swamped and stressed and understandably, and, there's so much to be managing and it's really hard to do. And, we know that when we're stressed and overwhelmed, it's just harder to be consistent and harder to think clearly. And really over the course of about 48 hours, I suddenly had this, thought of like, wow, why am I keeping this to myself? And I started to look for ways to integrate mindfulness into more traditional Western care back then. And then I kind of feel like I got lucky because the timing of that was sort of right when the wave was breaking between the public awareness and the research and the science of it. And, and people's interest has just grown and grown, I think, because it's so helpful.
Nice. And so when you integrated, maybe we can back up and just talk a little bit about when you're talking about mindfulness for parents, for kids, how do you introduce it? Mm-hmm. In what context do you introduce it? Where do you think it really supports, the family and children thriving?
That's a great question, and I would start with just a little bit of language around it. And I'm not sure everyone sees it exactly this way, but I think, within sort of the umbrella of contemplative practice and some of the traditions mindfulness comes out of, mindfulness means something very specific, which certainly has value, which is usually referred to as something like non-judgmental awareness. It's like in the midst of the distraction and the reactivity and all the places life sends us, there's value to practicing highly imperfectly, like our minds stay busy, but there's value to practicing staying more settled and seeing more clearly what's actually going on. And if you just, extrapolate that to parenting, like, of course, any moment we can see with more clarity and more of a sense of compassion and being settled what's actually going on, that makes it easier to handle that moment, and we're more likely to connect with our own best intentions and wisdom as a parent. And it's and like I said, it's not that anyone reaches an endpoint where they're living that way all the time, but it's a useful set of traits to try to develop. But for the purpose of that question you just asked about how I integrate it, I think in the West, it's also become a bit of an umbrella term for a lot of different contemplative practices. So then when people kind of shorthand a mindfulness program nowadays, very few people are really strictly talking about just that sense of awareness. And, things like self-compassion come up, which is a wonderful thing for a parent to practice. We all judge ourselves and are pretty harsh on ourselves as parents. And, Kristen Neff and all her research, which comes out of the same traditions, focusing on the value of learning to treat ourselves with kindness, is really valuable. So when I talk about mindfulness, I'm not specifically talking about that one practice as much as the umbrella, term. So to answer your question more specifically, and starting from what I was talking about why I started attempting to integrate it into Western medicine, the only thing any of us directly control in our lives in a very literal way is, our own choice in any particular moment. And that goes for parents as much as anybody else. So, we can't force anyone else to practice mindfulness. So I think the point of introduction is often just recognizing, helping people see that, everyday life, we tend to be pushed down certain paths if we're not trying to, live more intentionally. Life causes us to be distracted, and certainly the modern world causes a lot of reactivity and fear, and, it can just build and build and build. And the concept that parenting can be really difficult and really overwhelming, and that our children benefit if we practice mindfulness as adults, is really the starting point usually. And a lot of people, understandably, and I'm one of them, would love our kids to practice mindfulness regularly all the time, and that's great. But you can't make them. So really the endpoint, the one thing for most people to start with, is recognizing that if, as a parent, you practice mindfulness, which is, not the same thing for everybody, but, it can almost be seen a little bit like I hate the analogy is almost overly simplistic some way, but it's almost like a gym program of like choosing to encourage certain traits, that we might not otherwise practice, like hitting the gym, of being a little less distracted and a little more patient and responsive, and a little more self-compassionate or compassionate with others. Like anything else, if you practice that regularly, those things become more accessible day to day. And so for family mindfulness, that really is the foundation to me. It starts with the fact that as a parent, you could choose to do that. And it makes a huge difference for your kids. They're looking up to you all the time, and they're watching you all the time. And it helps you, both in terms of, actively modeling what hopefully you want to be modeling for your kids. And then it actually has some very specific benefits too when it comes to, sticking to a behavioral plan, or working on, giving positive feedback instead of just corrective feedback, or, you can really look at the intricacies of all the decisions we need to make as parents and the things we might be aiming to do. And for most of them, the practice of mindfulness can just be, generally supportive in all of them. It doesn't, fix anything on its own necessarily. There is some research, it can address some things like, stress and anxiety very nicely. But in a family, it's just that recognition that the more we're at our best as a parent, the more our children are going to benefit. And trusting in that, we all just want our children to thrive and do their best. And there are ways to use the same tools with kids. And if we have time, we can touch on some of those today. But, but that isn't, that isn't anything you fully control at first, but you can totally trust in the fact that if you develop your own practice as a parent, it's going to influence your whole family.
Mm-hmm. And so if a parent is sort of curious about that, they feel like, oh yeah, I'm a scatterbrain, or, we're all highly distracted, right?
Correct.
We live in a very distracted culture. So I think it's very easy for any parent to go, I could use some of that.
Sure.
What do you recommend in terms of, like, what does it look like if a parent wants to start to integrate a little bit of mindfulness into?
Sure. Well, if you want to look at the framework, broadly speaking, and it's hard to, I'm always aware that, like, there's a whole program here. There's many, many things we could discuss. There's many different practices. But on a basic level, like if you look at how the mindfulness-based stress reduction programs are set up, I don't love that, it's like more than stress reduction, but if you look at how this program's set up, there's really two things you can start looking at as a parent if you just want to get your toe in the water. One is there really is an increasing body of research suggesting that almost any amount of meditation practice begins to spill over into everyday life. Like if you just do it regularly, it's that gym program idea. Even as I say that, I think it's important to kind of reframe what we're talking about a little bit. People are often freaked out by the idea of meditation, or they dismiss it like, I can't quiet my mind, I can't sit still. And you just have to recognize that that isn't the goal. It's really an opportunity to practice things that you hope were going to become habitual if you practice them regularly. And I think one of the most major reframes, which I've stuck with a lot, pretty much since the pandemic, like during the pandemic, I felt this was just a particularly profound and important point, is you're practicing awareness, but also awareness with a sense of patience, because really what you're doing is you're giving yourself permission for 10 or 15 minutes to experience whatever is happening without all the reactive habits and without all the assumptions and without all the rest of what you normally add to it. So it's like, for 10 minutes, it's okay, that I'm hungry, but I'm not doing my hungry thing, or I'm anxious and I'm not doing my anxious thing, or I'm angry and I'm not doing my angry thing. And you're just building this ability to experience things without that immediate next thing. And there's much more to it than that, but that's a really important starting point. It does tie to another important detail, which is that another thing people are often afraid of. It doesn't mean things are all good. It doesn't mean you're going to be happy with everything going on. And it's actually meant to be very proactive. The real assumption is that through the practice, if we can stay settled more often, then when we have to go do something, we're going to do it with more clarity and precision, because, this is something. Actually, this is probably the farthest I've gotten into a mindfulness talk recently without saying one very profound, important thing, which is one of the early teachings that brought me into this whole practice was a really fundamental one, which is ask of everything you hear, is it true? Like, it doesn't matter that I'm saying it. It doesn't matter that Natalie says it. If you're going to get anything out of it, you have to decide, like, that makes sense and it could have an impact on my life. So therefore, I'm going to go practice it. So you really, everything I'm saying, question it, call me on it. I don't care, because I want to just make it accessible and valuable. So the goal, like, I think is something we all know, like on a day as a parent that we're totally rattled and knocked on our heels and, just, dizzied by the amount of stuff going on. If a problem comes up, we're going to handle it very differently than on a day when we happen to have slept really well and maybe we're coming out of vacation or we went for a long run and it calmed us down or whatever it is, that allows us to take action with more precision. And that's the bigger practice of mindfulness. It's not about the meditation. It's about the traits you're developing so that you can share those with your family or whoever else you're interacting with. So long answer to the question of, like, for, while there are layers and layers of different things you can explore, sometimes it's talked about almost as like a type of psychology and understanding of how the mind works. Really, you can just get started by just meditate, and it's hard and you got to schedule it and you got to carve out the time from somewhere. But it doesn't have to be a huge amount of time, and it starts to make a difference. And then I said there's two things. And I'm always a little hesitant about the second because it's so much easier to do. I don't want people to skip the meditation for it entirely. But it's also just an intention you can bring into everyday life, because the core practice is one of, generally speaking, there's different practices, but the beginning practice is often one of using something very physical to just be a point of our attention, so that, anything physical isn't the distractions. It's that straightforward. So, when someone says breathing meditation, it really just means the body moves with each breath. And that's something you can pay attention to that isn't all the fears of the future and everything else for a few seconds. So on some level, there's something often called informal practice, which is recognizing we can kind of bring that intention to the day and use it in smaller ways. And, you can use it with your kids. Like, am I sitting at dinner and thinking about work, or am I sitting at dinner and trying to pay attention to what they're saying? If I'm washing the dishes, can I just wash the dishes? And I can wash the dishes and ruminate. I'm probably pretty good at that. Or, I can just try to pay attention to the physical sensation of washing the dishes. And that's a mindfulness practice. And all of these things are not meant to be magic wands on their own. They're meant to be an accumulation of habit that eventually just becomes instinctual in everyday life. You start doing it without thinking about it quite so much.
Yeah.
So, and the goal is not a quick fix. And I think one of the favorite things, I forget which teacher said this. I mean, part of the reason it's called mindfulness practice is because just like a gym program, if you stop, then life is going to start knocking you on your heels again for a while, and then you just get up and do it again. You get back in shape. You start practicing again. Like it's just meant to be an ongoing practice of just honoring the traits you want to try to, repeat and bring to the world.
And I like what you said about, that it's not going to like magically change everything, but it's like now you have more opportunity for the choice, right? Of like, do I want to come back and be present with my child, or do I want to get distracted again about work? And even having that choice, I think a lot of us are so distracted or overwhelmed at the same time that it feels like there aren't those moments where we can really make a choice to
and just and just being able to do that a few times a day, begins to have some cumulative benefit. So, and you asked me also a little bit. I think you mentioned ADHD earlier, and and I think a lot of things around ADHD, it's not entirely unique to ADHD, but it's particularly important with ADHD to start examining these things from my experience because so ADHD is terribly misunderstood culturally. I think it's unfair to parents. It increases the weight of judgment and I think undermines progress when people don't fully understand it or dismiss it.
What do you feel that is the biggest misunderstanding?
Well, there's two things I think that are really important to understand. The first is that it is pretty definitively a proven medical condition. Like we don't have a test for it yet, but in spite of how people often talk about it, it's been described for close to 100 years. The genetics of ADHD are almost as strong as the genetics of height. There's a lot of group research that very clearly shows brain differences in groups of people with ADHD. We don't have the precision yet to do an individual test, but there is no doubt that it can be misdiagnosed, and that's a different discussion. But for an individual living with ADHD, it is concretely a chronic medical disorder. There was just an article in the paper today talking about how undertreated ADHD probably affects lifespan because, and if that doesn't make sense, it's because of the second misunderstanding of ADHD, which is it isn't an attention disorder specifically. One thing I should also say for anyone listening or listening to the recording later, the modern textbooks, the latest textbooks, don't use the term ADD. So it's all ADHD with either inattentive symptoms or hyperactive symptoms. So when I'm talking about it, I'm talking about both conditions. But the most major reframe about ADHD that totally changes how people understand it and intervene for it and kind of respect it in a way is that attention's part of a much larger umbrella of skills referred to as executive function. Executive function are like our life management skills. It's like the brain CEO. It's like the conductor of the orchestra. You could have the greatest musicians in the world, but you need somebody to help coordinate it and make music. So there's one part of the brain, to be overly simplistic, the brain turns out to be not so easily mapped, but the easiest way to understand it is like the front part of the brain primarily is responsible for executive function. And when it's underactive, the brain has a hard time with coordination and planning and staying on task in a very wide-ranging group of skills. It's almost like anything that you can put the word management to probably involves executive function. So you have to manage attention, which means, by the way, that people don't have just a short attention span. They hyper-focus on what's easy. They can't focus on what's hard. They can't transition attention easily. It's mismanagement of attention. Some people with ADHD mismanage their behavior. They're overly impulsive. They get in trouble that way. But it's also managing tasks, managing emotions, managing time, managing effort. That's all executive function based. So when kids or adults have issues with ADHD, it's very individual which of those areas are going to be affected most. But it's pretty profound and it affects a lot. It doesn't affect just school by any means. And the easiest way to, understand both the diagnosis, which is still clinical medicine at this point, so in terms of the diagnosis, we're looking for a pattern of executive function difficulties. And again, in terms of that seed of skepticism so many people have, I think the easiest way to understand it is as long as you're in the range of typical, you shouldn't be causing yourself some kind of chronic impairment. You shouldn't be undermining yourself regularly. That doesn't mean you're not getting good grades or succeeding at work. It could be that you're chewing yourself up internally because of your poor time management and forgetfulness and disorganization and whatnot. But impairment's part of the diagnosis. And then if you're going to intervene appropriately, there's no one intervention that works. There's a whole bunch of different stuff to talk about that has some evidence behind it. Because in the end, executive function is just too wide ranging. The medications, if you choose to use them, help a little bit over here. And, there's an emotional component you have to work on in different ways. And then you have to work on organization and time management in different ways. So it's a multifaceted intervention. But until you see it that way, people don't understand just how many different things in life it could be affecting, like sleeping and eating and, relationships and communication. That's like in March at a conference, I'm giving a talk on just the impact of ADHD on communication alone. And so, that's, you asked me, what people misunderstand about ADHD. I think that's the big picture of ADHD that, and then there's just totally unfair judgment about the interventions themselves and, what's effective and, what's research-based, and it really just makes life really difficult for anybody trying to make decisions around ADHD, or even to acknowledge that they have ADHD. And I work a lot with ADHD in my field of child development. One of the things I really enjoy is, like, in the big picture, it's a lot about promoting resilience and promoting development from an advocacy point of view. A lot of my day-to-day practice is trying to support kids who are, having difficulties in different parts of life. And certainly ADHD is one of the biggest ones. This is some of the, projects and stuff I've done over time. I see a lot of kids with ADHD. And one of the fundamental things you see is that, as it turns out, it should be intuitive to people. When your kids are struggling, that hurts as a parent. It's overwhelming sometimes. When kids are behind in executive function, that literally means they're usually behind in the level of independence they can muster until they catch up. So that's another demand on parents. It's stressful on marriages. Some of this has been researched too. I mean, parents of kids with ADHD are at risk for anxiety and depression and marital strife and losing confidence in their parenting and all sorts of things. But then, since the intervention is so multifaceted, it's no small thing to get on top of ADHD. There's some difficult decisions to do, and you're probably working with a psychologist on, managing behavior, and you got to deal with the school system. And meanwhile, your kid is probably emotionally reactive and causing a tone at home that, is overwhelming. And if, it's just like, any other challenging situation, if you can offer people tools so that they can get their feet under them first, that will then allow them to go out and manage ADHD differently. And a lot of people, when I start talking about mindfulness and ADHD care, which is, a common request, it's not, unfortunately, the message that, somehow we're just going to meditate ourselves out of having ADHD. At least in the term, in the amount of meditation that the, average, working person living life with a family can do. The research has not shown that, just through meditation, suddenly everything else goes away. However, ADHD causes a lot of stress. It causes a lot of emotionality, causes a lot of self-confidence and self-criticism issues. So the self-compassion practices can be very powerful. It causes all these other things that mindfulness practice, I think, addresses fairly uniquely, setting you up so you can then do all the rest of it with much more ease and have an easier time of it that way.
And so when you're coaching, families who have ADHD and they're interested, they recognize, like, wow, we're not going to solve this, like you said, with just one intervention. We really have to look at it holistically. Yep. How do you, without overwhelming the family?
Right.
Because they're prone
it can be very overwhelming. Absolutely.
What do you sort of recommend as, like, the first initial steps?
Yeah. Well, I think that's that isn't exactly how I would approach it, honestly, because I think it's so wide ranging. So there's a first step, but it isn't specific to, like, do this. So I think there's two initial steps that are important that will tell you what to do first. The first thing is, I think, try to understand executive function as a concept, because it shouldn't sound like, if you're living with ADHD, you don't want it to sound like a scientific term, like some doctor talked about it, on a podcast, and now I know executive function. It really should feel practical, because it explains so much of what's going on that the better you understand it, the better you can try to, meet kids where they are developmentally. So, a couple of common ones, for example, like if someone can't shift attention, they're going to come across as oppositional a lot, because if they're focused on a video game or even focused on a book, and you say, we got to go in 10 minutes, and they go, yeah. That's actually not being difficult or oppositional most of the time. If they can't shift attention, then they're literally just not even registering the words you're saying in any real way. And then they're going to get defensive when they realize they screwed up, and you're going to get angry because we're not out the door in time, and suddenly it all escalates. And it's really a neurologic issue. It's an ADHD symptom we have to address by recognizing like attention shifting has to come first and then the request, which is another demand on parents, another reason it's exhausting. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people estimate that, rule of thumb-ish is that, ADHD can be up to a 1/3 delay in executive function skills. And, short term, we can't change that. We can make a plan to catch someone up. So one thing to answer your question of where to get started is really just the educational side of things. It's just like depersonalizing it almost a little bit. Kids, like I had a wonderful experience I talk about pretty regularly where I saw someone who, and really all I had done was explain what I just explained here with a little more detail. And when they came back in a week or two, his mother's comment was like, life's better at home already. And I was like, she had a wonderful sense of humor. I knew she was sort of half joking. I said, well, how is it better at home? We haven't done anything yet. And she said, well, now that I realize that emotional reactivity is just a symptom of ADHD, I don't blame him for it anymore. But it's still terrible. It's like, what are we going to do about it? But it had totally changed their relationship dynamic, but she realized it was a symptom of ADHD and not like you should know better. Mm-hmm. So that's a foundational piece there, is just to try to broaden your understanding of ADHD. And then on the other side, to get more specific to your question about like, what's the first thing to do? I really think it is overwhelming. So what I often encourage people to do is almost a little bit of triage. Like, since you can't do everything at once, it's almost like you literally just want to make a list of like, what are the most, what's going on here that needs to change in the next few months, hopefully. And then prioritize it almost. It's like, all right, this is it, and then that starts defining like what interventions are going to be, maybe where you want to start. Some of it is also just like, do we have the bandwidth, or are things such a crisis that we want to just like go like do a bunch of things all at once and, try to address them, but they all, feed off each other. If your school plan improves, your emotional state may improve. And if you start medications, your school plan may improve, which improves your emotions and all so it's, it's very, individualized to me. Mm-hmm. But it starts with that sense of like, what's, for some kids, the sleep stuff might be the most disruptive thing. And you want to start with like, how do you get a handle on sleep? Because ADHD causes sleep problems, which makes your days even worse, which makes your ADHD even worse. And it just creates this vicious cycle. So it really has to be, and I think the second advantage to that kind of triage model of it can be, I really encourage people, like if there's stuff you can just table for a short amount of time, that improves relationships too. If somebody, just to pick an extreme, for example, like if somebody's, hitting and swearing, just focus on the hitting for a while, because, the swearing isn't going to change until that becomes the focus of your behavioral plan, perhaps, which means don't get so wrapped up in it. Like in your head, you might know that like next month we're going to work on this because it isn't okay. But, but you tone down the correction and the tension by just recognizing like, I'm going to do my best to just not get involved with that for a short stretch of time because I'm prioritizing this first. And that sense of that I found often helps. Or, to give a easier example, that was a pretty extreme one. It's the same thing if someone's swearing and the room's a mess. It's like, what, work on the swearing. In my mind, if we can get a handle on the swearing, we're then going to work on starting to clean up after yourself. But for a little while, I'm going to correct you less about cleaning up after yourself. So that is one of the ways I think you can approach the complexity of ADHD. And then I guess I would just end there. There's another way I organize my own thinking that I think parents sometimes find helpful, that I really think can help organize your thoughts over the long haul. Honestly, I think you can apply it to kids without ADHD too. I don't know if everyone listening or watching the recording later is necessarily going to be talking about ADHD, which is if you're kind of wide open about your thinking, I think you can divide the types of supports that are possible into 4 areas of life. And that's what I typically do when I'm getting started with families. For kids, I mean. So the part one is understanding who they are. So maybe we're not talking about ADHD. Maybe we're talking about a learning disability, or maybe we're talking about anxiety. Whatever it is, you can look at, is there something we need to adjust in their school plan? So can we get the school plan correct? That's one thing. And for kids with ADHD, they're entitled by a lot of school supports. So trying to coordinate the school plan is part one. Turns out the school plan tends to be accommodations, not interventions. The interventions for ADHD mostly happen outside of school. So the second thing to look at is, are there things we need to be doing outside of school that might help? Behavioral therapy or parent training or ADHD coaching, or, are there supports like that we can be doing? Kids with ADHD are behind in the skills that let them manage their own ADHD because they have a planning disorder. So they really heavily rely on adults to create the structure they're going to learn from. So are there things, so the second thing to look at any point in time is, like, does something have to shift around how we're managing behavior at home, or the morning routine, or the homework routine, or, whatever it is, teaching someone to work with emotions. That's part two. The third thing, which I used to lump into that one, but I think between what we now know about the impact of ADHD and just the direction this generation is going around general health, is the third thing to look at is general health. I mean, our physical health, with or without ADHD, ties into our overall resilience. One of the biggest impacts of technology and screens is it undermines all the other healthy habits you'd want someone to have. And then ADHD amplifies that tenfold. So the third thing to check in on, and by the way, this is just meant as an organizational structure. Hopefully there's a stretch of time where you go like, nah, school plan's good, check, and you can just sort of reassure yourself and sleep better. Like, no, we got a good school plan and we started the behavioral plan. So nothing more to do right now. But the third area to check in on is health, exercise and sleep and nutrition. And is there anything to adjust there? I would also include screen limits in that, and maybe mindfulness practice, but the whole basket of holistic health things impact, again, all kids and kids with ADHD in particular. And then the fourth one that's very specific to ADHD that, again, totally unfair to parents that there's so much judgment wrapped up in it, are making decisions about the medications because, they are demonized for no fair reason. They've been used since the 1920s. They are incredibly safe and effective when they're used appropriately. The actual research says that if they're managed well, 80 to 90% of people can use them and get at least some benefit with no significant side effects. It takes a lot of trial and error. It's a hard process, but that is the endpoint that's available to most people. And for me, the shorthand for the medications, I don't want to get into the medications that much tonight, is simply they're no different than other medications used in pediatrics if they're used appropriately. And the way to approach medications of any kind is no one should use a medication they don't need, but you don't need to be avoiding these medications more or less than you would avoid anything else in life. It's just like treating any other medical disorder as long as you're confident somebody has ADHD. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how I organize the possibilities for intervention in a nutshell. And I think, and then periodically you come back to it. If something starts going wrong in school, it's like, well, do one of these four things need adjusting?
Well, let's talk a little bit about area 3, which is
okay, great.
Because,
the health piece.
The one of the things you and I talked about, before we started the webinar, our last conversation, was something that I experience when families do neurofeedback as part of the stress support for the family system, is one of the number one reason why, kids don't benefit from it is because the power structure in the family has too much power in the hands of the kids in terms of whether or not they want to do it. And so in talking about, encouraging a plan and then going into action on a plan, how do you work with families around sort of the idea of authority and, boundaries?
That's a huge question. A really important one. No, I love it. And I think it's an important one to address. And I think it is one way, it's almost unfair to parents the way that type of information is presented, honestly, sometimes. So kids are kids. I think we all know that. part, right? I don't think anyone's gonna, is it true? We'll start at this. I said, is it true? And that part is true. So I actually find it useful to frame that almost through the lens of executive function in child development. So it turns out that path of executive function that I described is true for all kids. So kids with ADHD are struggling with it, just like some kids could have language delays. But executive function, which is the part of the brain that's responsible for organization, planning, foresight, figuring things out, thinking of the future, doesn't mature until they're almost in their mid-20s. So as parents, we need to recognize that limits and boundaries are part of teaching kids strong executive function. They're part of getting kids where they need to go. So positive parenting is really vital in that kids, relationships and kids thrive when they're mostly getting positive feedback. So it's not wrong to focus on all the positive things we can do to make kids feel about themselves, good about themselves and spend time with them. And all of that is just, I love that. It's like the most important thing as a parent. But it is important to recognize that developmentally, they're not little adults, they're kids. So that we need tools as parents that correct behavior. We don't want to be using only those tools, but we need them in hand. And we need to make decisions sometimes that that our kids aren't that thrilled with, whether it's screen limits or we've decided neurofeedback is really important, so we just got to do neurofeedback. And, neurofeedback, probably isn't the most exciting thing for most kids to be doing for the time they're asked to do it. So, we have to sort of combine all these different ideas and realize that, we can try to get them on board for doing it just purely because they think it's the right thing. But most kids aren't going to do that, and they need to learn through a regular schedule. And we need to use motivations, like maybe you tie it to a reward plan, maybe, you tie it to some plan, like if you're going to do your screen time, for the next 3 months, if you're going to do screen time, neurofeedback comes first. And that's just an if-then statement. If you want to do that, you're going to do this first. And it's just normal that kids need that. And I think there's plenty of people out there culturally and, some of them pretty prominent, sort of suggesting that, we're going to talk and coach our kids like Mary Poppins into doing everything they need to do. And that exhausts parents because it just isn't realistic when you understand child development, when you understand executive function, that, that they don't have it. They have no time window. They don't see outside of the immediate, like what's in front of their face when they're young. And they can't tie together. An example I use sometimes is like, obviously, I'm talking very generally. There's some kids who break the rules, right? It's all a bell curve of life. Mm-hmm. But generally speaking, as an adult, you might decide like, I've never run before, but it would be really cool to run the New York Marathon. And I know I'm going to suffer for the first 6 months of training because I'm not even a runner, but I just want to do this thing. And even though there's no positive feedback at all for those first 6 months, it just hurts. I know it's going to get me to my goal. That is very grown-up thinking. For a child, they don't go that far. It's like it needs to be positive and motivational and supportive, and that takes work from us as parents to make happen quite often. So they might need a sticker chart if they're really young, or some other broader reward plan, or we create the routine and support the routine happening. And maybe if we have a relatively compliant child, that's enough, but we're the ones prompting the routine. And it's just, and that to me is just that's typical child development. So that's the bottom line. If it's, I sometimes describe it as two-step decision making as a parent, because there are a lot of situations where we as the grown-ups in the room have to decide, like, what's the question we're really asking our kids here. So I'll take neurofeedback as an example. I was thinking of screen limits as another example, but like if the question, if we as parents and talking to Natalie say like, it would be really cool if, Joe decided to do neurofeedback. But if Joe doesn't want to do neurofeedback, that's okay. That's one type of discussion to have. So the first layer of discussion is we all talk together and say like, yeah, that would be cool. But if, it's okay if Joe's not ready for it, that'll be okay right now. So then you might go into one type of discussion where you're trying to get them to make the decision you want them to do, but it really is okay if they decide not to. But there's plenty of times of life, and by the way, this is even more intense when kids have ADHD, because ADHD is a planning disorder, where we as the grown-ups in the room might decide like, neurofeedback really has to happen right now. We've tried everything else. We got to do neurofeedback now. And it doesn't mean you're going to like force them there and like, make them sit in their chair with your hand on your shoulders or something. But it totally changes how you're going to have the discussion, because you know that we're going to try to steer them there, and hopefully it'll be mutual and hopefully they'll make a good choice. But the bottom line is like, it's going to happen. And that's important for us to know as adults before we go into that discussion. And there's many situations that's true. And certainly screen limits aren't exactly the same idea, but I know you had wanted me to touch on it. And it's totally the same idea of like, the entire product of a smartphone is designed to distract and, and suck us in and lose our attention and, overspend our money. And it's like an uneven playing field. There's a concept called persuasive design, which is, they are constantly collecting data and reinforcing everything they can do that makes our phones, either literally or practically addictive, depending on, who you're reading. Practically speaking, they certainly are, whether it's not a literal addiction. And kids just, they have immature executive function. They're kids. They're not going to be, most of them can't manage that fully well on their own. And that doesn't mean we have to be, it's just, there is no good answer. It's not a perfect answer. It's like this, it doesn't mean there should be none, but it does mean we have to recognize most kids can't make solid choices about it until they're much older. So we have to find some really, solid middle ground where we're the ones, doing a screen bedtime every night, or if we have a very young child, we're monitoring their social media account if they're on it at all, or maybe even better, we're deciding they shouldn't be on social media because they're too young. I mean, that's what the actual recommendation is, or, but it's totally incumbent on us to realize that screens are just, problematic if they're used in an open-ended way by most children, not all, but most. And, just like if we had someone who wanted to do nothing but eat cheesecake all day long, we'd say like, probably not more cheesecake today. That's, 7 slices, whatever your limit as a personal parent is, it's got to be something, it's like 7, 4, 2 slices, whatever it is. It's like you're making the decision as an adult. That's kind of where screen time sits. It's like, there's something that you feel comfortable with as a parent, cool, but you're probably the one who's going to have to say like, that's enough video game time, or no, you need time off for an hour before bed, or you're too young for social media. And that's a really, really challenging but vital part of parenting it for this generation. There are certainly narrow beneficial uses of technology. I love my smartphone. I use it all the time. But open-ended use and social media, really does start to have damaging effects on kids, and we need to, protect them from that as adults. And again, to tie it back to why I brought it up just now, it ties back to that concept around, your question about neurofeedback of like, we just have to decide in any situation, is it time for an open-ended discussion, or is it time for like, I'm going to try to teach you the right thing to do it, but in the end, you're not staying up till 2. And, we're going to try to help you make a good choice about bedtime, but but in the end, there is no option to stay up really late on your device.
Right.
So, and that falls on us, all of which, has much bigger benefit in the big picture, because, if we start doing that as parents, if we take care of ourselves as best as we're able to, find, parenting has a lot of demands, but find whatever we can do to take care of ourselves. We set some limits. We teach kids, through positive feedback, all the things that has to say about relationship and feeling good about themselves. And we set clear limits and boundaries, because that's part of learning life too, is learning to deal with frustration and learning from those things. That has long-term benefit for, how our kids are going to grow up.
I mean, and part of what I'm hearing from you is that it's really about first the parents themselves, and then that then gets extended to how they relate with their child. If they're confident in why they're going to do what they're going to do and empower themselves with that confidence, then that naturally extends into how they're going to parent.
I think, that's an interesting way to phrase it, but I think, you're right. And it sort of, ends where we started a little bit about like this, and whether or not you practice mindfulness, the same concept holds true, which is, if you can relate to whatever's going on with as much skill as you're able to muster, which doesn't mean perfect, it's just as much as you can do to handle that situation, that's going to put you, in a situation where you're able to get in touch with your own best intentions, able to model what you want for your children, and it's sort of like by parenting yourself in that way first, you bring your best game more often.
Well, I looked at the time here and I'm like, oh my goodness, we're really out of time. I have like
Okay.
16 more questions about helping kids thrive and structure. And so maybe this will have to be a part two. But
Okay.
before we go, do you have any like go-to resources that you recommend for parents around like any of what we've been talking about that we could share?
The simplest thing is I actually have my website organized that way. So
Oh, great.
my website's developmentaldoctor.com, and I have like, a general child development page and a mindfulness page and an ADHD page, all of which is, to the best of my knowledge, sticking to evidence-based and practical interventions. So so the simplest thing is you just go to developmentaldoctor.com and you'll
Great.
find all that kind of information, hopefully as a resource hub is really my goal.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Mark, for taking the time to talk
You're
to
welcome.
me. And I know we got a lot of interest in this topic. People, I think, are really hungry to, just feel like they have the tools and that there is a path forward. And so we'll put your website and all your contact info in the email we send out and also on the YouTube. So
Great.
thank
All
you
right.
again.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's good seeing you.
Yeah, likewise. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Take care.